Imagine looking at a high-definition photograph of, like, your childhood home, right? But the front door is painted a slightly different shade of red.
Oh, yeah. That would be weird.
Right. It's perfectly recognizable. I mean, the windows are exactly where they should be. The shape of the roof is identical. The landscaping is totally familiar. But as you stare at it, this creeping sensation settles in the pit of your stomach.
Like something is wrong.
Exactly. It feels fundamentally hollow. You find yourself thinking, something feels off, but I can't explain what.
Yeah, I know that exact feeling.
And that is exactly what happens when a massive studio spends like $15 million an episode to adapt a story you deeply love. They perfectly recreate the wardrobe and the sets, but they completely forget to adapt the soul.
It's basically the narrative equivalent of the uncanny valley.
The uncanny valley, like with robots.
Yeah, exactly. Usually we use that term in robotics or 3D animation, when a face looks almost perfectly human, but something in the dead eyes or the stiff micro-expressions signals to your brain that it's a corpse or a machine.
It triggers that innate revulsion.
Right, exactly. We experience that exact same phenomenon with story. You are seeing all the superficial, recognizable markers of the characters in the world you love, but the underlying architectural framework is altered in a way that your brain registered correct.
Even if you don't have the screenwriting vocabulary to articulate why.
Totally. You just know it feels fake.
And giving you that vocabulary is our mission for today's deep dives. We are stepping back from the typical internet discourse of, this show is good or this show is bad.
Because that gets old fast.
It really does.
Yeah.
So instead, we're going to unpack the actual structural mechanics of storytelling. We are looking at this masterclass in adaptation analysis, guided by the work of a published author and video essayist known as Hello Future Me.
Yeah, specifically focusing on their diagnosis of Netflix's live-action adaptation of the second season of Avatar, The Last Airbender.
Right. And just to be clear, we aren't doing a plot summary today. Assuming you know the lore, the characters, and the broad strokes of the Ba Sing Se storyline, we're going to look under the hood.
We're getting into the mechanics.
Exactly. The thesis we're exploring is that this live-action adaptation is telling half the story. And here's the twist. That doesn't mean half the plot is missing because they ran out of runtime.
Far from it, actually. The argument is that it's telling half the story because of how it fundamentally mishandles the internal mechanics of character.
Which is a huge claim.
It is. When we talk about a television adaptation, the conversation almost always devolves into, like, a ledger of plot points. What was cut? What was kept?
Did we get to see the specific shiny thing from the original?
Right. But this analysis shifts the focus entirely onto the concept of agency. It forces us to ask a much harder question. What happens to a narrative when characters are moved from point A to point B through a plot, but are stripped of the specific active decisions that define who they actually are?
Okay, let's unpack this. Because on paper, it sounds like a paradox. How can a show look exactly like the original, down to the specific martial arts poses and the exact color of the costumes, yet feel like it's completely missing the plot?
It's a great question.
To answer that, we need to look at a microscopic moment, a scene that lasts maybe 30 seconds, but it perfectly encapsulates the entire overarching flaw of how this adaptation was written.
I know exactly the scene you're talking about.
Yeah, we need to talk about Zuko and the Courtyard of Lanterns.
Right. So to understand the gravity of this 30-second scene, we have to look at the psychological architecture of Zuko at exact point.
Set the stage.
In the second season, Zuko is in exile. He is a fugitive in the Earth Kingdom, living in disguise as a refugee. For his entire life up to this point, his identity has been a monolith.
He is the banished prince.
Exactly. And his singular obsessive goal is to capture the Avatar, to win back the approval of a horrifically abusive father. But in exile, that monolith starts to fracture. He is fundamentally wrestling with his own identity.
Because he's finally away from the Fire Nation propaganda.
Right. The core dramatic tension isn't whether he will catch the Avatar anymore. It's a terrifying internal question. Does he want a humble, peaceful life where he can just be a normal teenager? Or does he still crave his abuser's approval?
Which would require him to pursue power and the throne.
Exactly.
He's a teenager carrying the weight of generational trauma, and he is deeply confused. And right in the middle of this intense internal crisis, he goes on a date.
He does.
He goes on a date with a local Earth Kingdom girl named Jin. Let's break down the mechanics of what happens in the original 2005 animated version, because the literary construction of this scene is brilliant.
It really is beautifully written.
They are walking together after dinner, and they end up in this beautiful little courtyard. It's filled with unlit lanterns. Zuko, who up until this point in the entire series has been angry, brooding, and totally consumed by a violent mission, tells Jin to close her eyes.
Right.
And then he uses his firebend. He moves through the specific martial arts forms of bending, complete with a beautiful traditional musical cue swelling in the background, and he lights every single lantern in that courtyard.
The screenwriting term for this is subversion of expectation, but it functions on multiple levels, not just for the audience, but crucially for the character himself.
Tell me more about that.
Well, think about what firebending has meant to Zuko for the entirety of his life. It has strictly meant violence. It has meant rage. It is the tactical tool he uses to hunt, to intimidate, to destroy.
It's a weapon.
Exactly. And on a much darker personal level, it is the very element that his father used to permanently scar him. Fire is the physical manifestation of his trauma, and it is only weapon.
And in this quiet courtyard in the Earth Kingdom, he actively chooses to use it for something else entirely.
He uses it for illumination. He uses it for connection. He uses it to nurture the blossoming of a teenage romance. He uses a weapon of war simply to make a girl smile.
That's incredible.
It is a profound structural pivot in his character arc. This is the first time Zuko allows himself the vulnerability of just being an awkward kid.
Wow.
And even more importantly, it is the first time someone looks at his fire, the thing that has caused him unimaginable pain, and the thing he uses to inflict pain on others and find.
It's an incredibly active choice. I mean, he decides to risk exposing his true identity, knowing that revealing himself as a firebender in the heart of the Earth Kingdom could lead to his immediate arrest or death.
The stakes are huge.
Yeah, he weighs that massive risk against the simple desire to create a moment of wonder, and he chooses.
Yeah.
That is a defining character moment.
Yeah.
Okay, so that is the architectural foundation of the original scene. Now, let's look at the 2026 Netflix live-action version of this exact same scenario.
Yeah.
Because they don't skip this scene. They adapt.
They do adapt.
Jin is there. She is sweet. Zuko is there. And he is playing the cool, brooding teenager. They go on the date. They walk into the very same courtyard. But the lanterns are already lit.
The lanterns are already on. Zuko never lights them. He just stands there.
It makes my brain itch. Zuko just stands there while they look at the lanterns together. Like, what is the point?
What's fascinating here is that tiny omission is the crux of the entire structure. The aesthetic is perfectly preserved. If you were to take a screenshot of the Netflix scene and hold it up next to a screenshot of the original animated, they would be nearly indistinguishable.
You literally couldn't tell the difference.
Right. You have two teenagers standing in a softly lit courtyard surrounded by glowing paper lanterns. The visual data, but the narrative weight has been completely hollowed out.
Netflix gives us the aesthetic of Zuko being an awkward kid on a date, but they completely strip away the internal mechanism that earns that moment. They rob him of the decision.
Completely.
It's like writing a screenplay about a brilliant, notorious hacker who is trying to go straight. You write a scene where the character is sitting in a dark room wearing a hoodie illuminated only by the glow of a terminal screen.
A very classic trope.
Yeah, you've nailed the visual aesthetic of the hacker, but you never actually write the scene where a shadowy syndicate offers them $10 million to do one last cyber heist, and you never show them making the agonizing, active choice to turn the money down.
Which is the most important part.
Exactly. Without that choice, you don't have character growth. You just have a guy in a hoodie typing.
I think that analogy perfectly isolates the failure here. What the writer is doing in that hypothetical hacking script and what the showrunners are doing in the courtyard of lanterns is giving the audience the result of a character state without the mechanism that achieved it.
They skip the work.
Right. Zuko never gets to make the active decision to repurpose his trauma into something. He never experiences the terrifying vulnerability of showing someone his fire, and he's denied the psychological validation of someone finding it.
Which is just tragic.
It is. The visual shell is intact, but the soul of this, it is half.
And this isn't just a nitpick about a 30-second date scene. This is patient zero. We can use this lantern courtyard to diagnose a systemic structural illness that infects the entire second season of the show.
Oh, it's everywhere.
We've just seen how Zuko lost an active choice. But when we zoom out, we see this flattening of character autonomy happening to almost every member of the cast. It creates this overarching phenomenon of the half.
The pattern becomes undeniably clear when you examine how the adaptation handles moments of high. Let's look at the protagonist, Aang. There is a pivotal, devastating sequence in the narrative where Aang loses his sky bison, Appa. Now, it's crucial to understand that Appa is not just a pet or a mode of transportation.
No, not at all.
Appa is a spiritual companion, and the last living link Aang has to his culture, people, and his entire past, all of which were wiped out in a genocide.
Which is incredibly heavy stuff.
Extremely. Losing Appa is not a mere inconvenience. It is a profound, traumatic severing of his last tie. In the original narrative architecture, this catastrophic loss triggers the Avatar state. But it's not the controlled, powerful state. It is a terrifying, uncontrollable defense mechanism fueled by pure, unadulterated grief and...
It's the closest Aang ever comes to becoming a monster. He is so consumed by the loss that he's willing to destroy everything around him.
Exactly. Exactly. The original story forces Aang to confront the darkest, most violent parts of his own nature. But when you look at the Netflix version, the execution is entirely...
How so?
Well, Aang does go into the Avatar state after losing Appa, but he doesn't reach that terrifying full level of rage. He doesn't hurt anyone. He doesn't destroy anything. He enters the state of immense power, hovers there for a moment, and then he's it.
The power's down.
Yeah, the emotional crescendo is artificial.
It feels incredibly cynical.
Yeah.
It's as if the producers looked at a spreadsheet of iconic moments, saw Aang goes into Avatar state with glowing tattoos, and checked the box for the cool visual effect.
That's exactly what it...
But they actively avoided dealing with the messy, dark, complex reality of a deeply traumatized kid losing control. It's the visual of the Avatar state without the psychological terror of it.
And this muting effect happens everywhere.
It really does. Take Katara and the Painted Lady storyline, where her active rebellion against the Fire Nation's pollution is softened. Or look at another crucial Zuko moment.
The Zappa scene.
Yeah. There's a scene where Zuko has the opportunity to capture Aang, his ultimate prize. He makes the choice to let Aang go. But in the adaptation, he doesn't free Appa at the same time.
Right.
This fractures his decision. It makes his choice incredibly unclear and muted. The operative part of the decision, the part that would show true ideological growth or true malice, is left hanging in the wind.
It's so frustrating.
The plot is technically moving forward, but as a viewer, you are constantly forced to fill in these massive psychological gaps yourself.
And perhaps the most glaring structural example of this half-story syndrome is the complete omission of the guru.
Man, cut that.
Structurally, this is a massive load-bearing pillar of the original story. Aang must undergo intense spiritual training to consciously master the Avatar. This isn't a physical montage. It is essentially a deep dive into his own psyche.
It's all internal.
Exactly. It forces him to confront his deepest fears, found survivor's guilt, and ultimately his earthly attachment to Katara.
Right. The guru is essentially serving as a fantasy therapist, guiding Aang through a literal unblocking of his chakras, which are just metaphors for his emotional baggage.
It is an entirely internal, based exclusively on making difficult, active choice. Now, it is entirely fair to acknowledge that adapting a purely internal, spiritual, metaphor-heavy live-action medium is notoriously difficult.
Sure, it's not easy to film someone just sitting and meditating.
Exactly, but the critique isn't simply that they cut the episode. The problem is how they attempt to compensate for its absence while still demanding the narrative reward.
Right, they want to have their cake and eat it too.
Yes, they still want the moment where Aang masters the Avatar. So they show Aang walking toward an astral version of himself. But from a screenwriting perspective, that visual trick only covers a fraction of what that journey actually requires.
It's a shortcut.
A massive shortcut. They haven't done the psychological setup. They are handing out the profound emotional reward of self-mastery without forcing the character to do any of the exhausting emotional labor required to achieve.
I hear what you're saying about the emotional labor, but I am going to push back hard on this.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because if I am a writer in that Netflix room in 2026, I am screaming at my monitor right now. We are talking about two fundamentally different mediums. A Cartoon Network in 2005 gave the original creators 20-plus episodes, each 23 minutes long, serialized over months.
True.
You have the breathing room to do a standalone episode about unblocking chakras. Netflix is operating on an 8-episode, hour-long binge model. It's a completely different pacing piece.
It definitely changes the rhythm.
Right. If they stop the momentum of the overarching war plot to have Aang sit on a mountain and do fantasy therapy for a full hour, the modern binge viewer is going to pick up their phone and start scrolling. You cannot do a one-to-one translation of pacing.
Yeah.
Netflix have to cut things. They have to condense. Shouldn't we extend a massive amount of grace to the writers for navigating these brutal format constraints?
That is the ultimate defense of modern adaptation. And it's a completely valid logistical reality. The format absolutely dictates the pace. But I'll counter that by pointing out that the critique of the show is not rooted in a purist, toxic fandom demand that every single frame of the 2005 cartoon be transcribed onto the screen.
No one is asking for a shot-for-shot remake of the whole series.
Exactly. It is universally understood that adaptation requires destruction. You have to break the original thing to rebuild. The golden standard for this is Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings films.
Oh, right. They cut Tom Bombadil, which changes the pacing of the entire first act.
Right.
They drastically altered Faramir's initial reaction to the ring, making him far more tempted by it than he was in the books.
Yes.
And they added a contingent of elves to the Battle of Helm's Deep. Purists were furious, but structurally, the movies are masterful.
Exactly. So why did the changes in The Lord of the Rings work while the changes in the Netflix adaptation? Because Jackson and his co-writers made changes to serve the pacing of a cinematic medium while preserving and sometimes even heightening the stakes and the agency of the characters.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's about agency.
Yes. Faramir's temptation by the ring in the film actually gives him a more active, difficult choice to make when he eventually lets Frodo go. The problem with the Netflix adaptation isn't that they are making changes to fit an 8-episode format. The problem is the architectural nature of the changes they are choosing to make.
They're stripping away the agency.
Exactly. They are systematically replacing strong, active, defining character decisions with smaller, muted, passive ones. They are reducing the overall number of choices a character.
I see.
If you only have 8 hours instead of 15, the screenwriting solution isn't to remove the character's agency. The solution is to condense the plot so their moments of agency shine even brighter.
Okay, that clarifies the issue immensely. It's not that they're trimming the fat to make it lean. It's that they're cutting out the bone structure and leaving us with a puddle.
That's a great way to put it.
Which naturally brings us to a really bizarre contradiction in how this show was produced. Because if a studio is willing to cut corners on character development, if they're muting emotional stakes and hollowing out decisions, you would naturally assume that they are just careless.
Right, you'd think they just don't care.
You would assume it's a cynical cash grab by producers who don't respect the source material and just want to churn out content. But the maddening irony of this show is that that isn't true at all. They are actually hyper-focused on adapting certain elements with meticulous, painstaking, obsessive detail.
They really are.
They're just focusing all of that energy and money on the absolute wrong thing. We have to talk about the paradox of faith.
This is where the analysis shifts from a critique of the writing to a fascinating examination of modern franchise production philosophy. There is a deep structural inconsistency between what Netflix chooses to adapt faithfully and what they choose to or omit.
It's wild to look at.
We just saw how they completely gutted the emotional core of the Wyatt character. But then you look at the climax, the massive battle in the Crystal Catacombs beneath the city of Ba Sing Se.
The crossroads of death, the huge finale where all the disparate storylines finally crash into each other.
The Netflix adaptation of this specific sequence is practically reverent. It is treated like holy text. It is adapted almost shot for shot from the...
It's crazy how close.
The production team clearly identified this specific battle as a tentpole moment. It is nearly line for line in the dialogue, but it goes beyond. They meticulously recreated the specific martial arts bending forms that each character performed.
Choreography is...
It is. When Aang encases himself in a shell of crystal armor, when Azula unleashes her blue fire, when Zuko counters with his specific fire whip, the choreography is a mirror image of the cartoon. It is visually stunning.
And if you are a fan, your immediate reaction is, this is awesome. You want to see the cool fights brought to life with a massive CGI budget. But if we dig into the literary architecture of the scene, this hyperfixation on visual accuracy is actually a massive storytelling trap. Because the uncomfortable truth of screenwriting is this: you could completely throw out the fight choreography.
People don't want to hear that, but it's true.
You could invent entirely new martial arts moves. You could restructure the physical geography of the catacombs. You could have them fighting on a flat plane. None of that actually matters to the structural integrity of the story.
That is the harsh reality of narrative function. The physical movements, the sparks, the crystal armor, that is all just set dress. It is aesthetic execution.
Right.
What matters in the catacomb sequence, the only things that actually hold the narrative together are the choices being made amidst the chaos. It is the agonizing moment Zuko is forced to choose between joining the Avatar and his uncle on the path of redemption, or siding with his manipulative, psychopathic sister Azula to reclaim his birthright.
That's the real drama.
Yes. It is the heartbreaking moment his uncle, Iroh, steps in to hold off the Fire Nation so the heroes can escape, fully knowing it means his own capture and imprisonment for treason. Those decisions are the load-bearing pillars of the...
If you keep those specific character decisions intact, the fight could take place in a blank white room with the characters throwing snowballs at each other, and it would still carry the exact same emotional weight.
Yes. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the structural critique here is that modern adaptations across the board continually fall prey to this exact paradox.
It happens so often.
They prioritize visual fan service over emotional continuity. They allocate millions of dollars to ensure Aang's crystal armor has the perfect refractive index, and they make sure Azula's fire blast is the exact shade of blue, but they neglect the internal mechanics that made fans care about the scene in the first place.
The pretty lights distract from the empty room.
Exact. The Quiet Date with Jin, where a boy chooses to use a weapon of war to create light instead of pain, is arguably far more important to the overarching narrative architecture of the story than making sure a crystal shield looks perfectly
Here's where it gets really interesting. It reveals a profound misunderstanding of what audiences are actually connected. We think we remember the cool martial arts move, but what actually anchored those memories in our brains was the chain of decisions that made those characters who they are.
We remember how we felt.
Right. And the tragedy here is that the Netflix show show isn't completely devoid of these. They do include some solid decisions. Like, they show Zuko blaming his uncle Iroh for not taking the throne when he had the chance. That is a great, complex character moment.
It's a really good...
But it's isolated. They aren't building a consistent foundation of these small, interesting choices. And so, even with an 8-hour runtime and a budget that rivals blockbuster films, the reliance on visuals over internal character arc makes the show feel empty.
It's a frustrating experience.
It's like they built a beautiful, multi-million-dollar sports car, polished the exterior to a flawless mirror finish, but forgot to install the transmission. You can rev the engine all day, it sounds great, but the story is never going to move forward.
It creates a deeply dissonant viewing experience. Every major sequence clearly feels like it's drawing from the original. It successfully triggers the visual memory of the original in your brain, but because the internal connective tissue is missing, it rarely achieves its own independent emotional resonance.
You're just remembering the old show.
You are feeling nostalgia, not narrative engagement.
Now, if we stopped right there, this would be a pretty depressing deep dive. You'd think the writer's room was entirely incompetent and the show was just a total unmitigated disaster of storytelling.
Which it isn't.
No, that simply isn't true. And to prove that the writers in that Netflix room are actually capable of making smart, highly effective structural changes, we have to look at the triumphs of the adaptation, because Season 2 does make several massive improvements.
It really is a step up.
It is a huge step up from the first season of the live-action show, and in some very specific instances, it arguably improves upon elements of the 2005 original canon.
The analysis is very clear about giving credit where it is. Season 2 is, on the whole, a significant structural improvement over Season 1. And the areas where it succeeds are precisely the areas where the writers abandoned the shot-for-shot philosophy and applied the correct philosophy of adaptation.
They actually adapted it.
Exactly. They didn't just copy the visuals. They analyzed the core function of a character or a storyline, identified its weaknesses in live action, and refined it. The most prominent, undeniable example of this is their complete overhaul of the primary antagonist, Princess.
Let's talk about Azula, because this is a fascinating course correction. In the first season of the Netflix show, the writers really fumbled her characterization.
They struggled with her.
She was prone to screaming fits of anger, she lacked self-control, and she just didn't feel like the calculating, conniving, terrifyingly intelligent villain fans knew. She felt like an insecure teenager throwing tantrums, which, to be fair, she is an insecure teenager, but her defining trait is her cold, lethal perfectionism.
The creative team clearly absorbed that feedback, and they executed a massive psychological overhaul, too. Visually, she has a completely different outfit, and the actor's vocal delivery has shifted entirely.
She sounds much more menacing.
But those are surface changes. More importantly, her psychological profile has been fundamentally correct. She makes different kinds of decisions now. She operates with a cold, terrifying calculation. The analysis specifically points out that the show allows her to straight up murder.
Which is a huge distinction. In a 2005 cartoon aimed at children, the violence is often implied or off-screen. People get blasted by fire and just get knocked out.
Right, there are limits.
But in live action, when you're aiming for a slightly older, binge-watching demographic, allowing a villain to be genuinely lethal establishes dramatic stakes in a way a cartoon sometimes can. If Azula is just knocking people over, she's a nuisance. If she is executing people, she is a terror.
Exactly. Furthermore, her dynamic with her two closest allies, Mei and Ty Lee, is altered. The analysis acknowledges that some purist fans might quibble with the specific changes to how that friendship is portrayed, but structurally, the overall effect is highly successful.
It works for the new medium.
The writers made a deliberate, calculated change to the source material to better serve the tone and stakes of their specific live-action adaptation, and it worked beautifully.
Another significant improvement is the introduction of genuine interpersonal conflict among the heroes. In Season 1, the arguments between Aang, Katara, and Sokka always felt hollow, shallow, and contrived.
They argued over nothing.
Exactly. It felt like the writers knew the screenwriting rule that every scene must have conflict, so they just had the characters bicker about nothing important. But in Season 2, there was a major, genuine argument between the protagonists that actually feels earned. It feels rooted in their differing, deeply held worldviews and the immense, crushing stress of fighting a global war.
And we must return to Zuko. Because despite the baffling misstep with the Courtyard of Lanterns, the writers achieved something truly remarkable with the broader architecture of the arc.
Oh, this is the best part of it.
The analysis highlights Episode 2 of this new season as arguably the strongest hour of television the live-action far. It is a brilliant amalgamation of several disparate storylines, primarily focusing on Zuko traveling alone through the Earth and the simultaneous introduction.
And this is where they take a tiny 30-second scene from the original series and weave it perfectly into the new narrative structure. In the animated show, there is a fleeting moment where Zuko is wandering alone and he meets a young girl in a random Earth Kingdom village. The girl has a terrible, disfiguring burn scar on her.
It's such a small moment in the original.
It's a very brief interaction, but structurally it's monumental. It's the first time Zuko looks at a civilian victim of the Fire Nation and realizes, if she is an innocent victim of fire, maybe I am too. Maybe I didn't deserve the scar my father gave me.
It's the catalyst.
It is the seed of his ideological turning. The author of the critique admitted they were terrified. Netflix would cut this scene because it's so small and doesn't advance the overarching plot.
But the writers recognized its structural importance and they incorporated it directly into the spine of their version of Go.
They nailed it.
Furthermore, they utilized the real-world time jump between filmings to allow Zuko's character to physically and emotionally mature, making his internal turmoil even more palpable. The analysis specifically praises the actor, Dallas, for brilliantly capturing the heavy, complicated psychology of an exiled prince, recognizing his own trauma reflected in the very people his nation is actively terrorizing.
It is a masterclass in acting and adaptation. And speaking of trauma and the Fire Nation royal family, we have to talk about Zuko's mother, Ursa.
Yes, let's talk about Ursa.
Because this is the moment where I think the adaptation doesn't just equal the original, it vastly outshines the... In the original series, the mystery of what happened to Zuko's mom was this brawling, convoluted plotline.
It was messy.
It was eventually resolved years later in a series of comic books that, frankly, weren't great. Yeah. The original lore involved secret identities, ancient face-stealing spirits, magical memory wipes. It was a deeply convoluted mess.
It suffered from severe lore bloat. The original creators complicated what should have been a deeply grounded emotional story with unnecessary mythological mechanics.
Completely.
Netflix, however, looked at that tangled web of comic book continuity and made the incredibly smart decision to simplify it entirely. In their flashbacks, they establish a much cleaner, more powerful narrative.
What did they change?
Ursa simply tried to take her children away from her abusive husband, the Fire Lord Ozai. She tried to orchestrate a mundane, desperate escape to protect her kid, but she was caught and banished.
The insight here is brilliant because it taps into a universal writing principle. Human stakes will almost always resonate more deeply with an audience than mythological stakes.
Absolutely.
A mother desperately trying to get her children away from a terrible, abusive father is a situation that is universally understood. It evokes immediate empathy. A plot involving a magical face-stealing spirit requires exposition and a glossary.
You need a flowchart just to
Exactly. Live action thrives on human resonance, and grounding the trauma of the royal family in recognizable domestic abuse makes it infinitely more evocative.
It is the perfect example of additive destruction in adaptation. You break the convoluted canon to build a stronger emotion.
So what does this all mean? We have this incredible paradox. The Netflix showrunners are clearly not incompetent. They know how to adapt a story conceptually when they want to.
They have the skills.
They know how to identify a structural flaw in the original material, like Ursa's backstory, and streamline it for maximum emotional impact. They know how to fix a broken character dynamic, like they did with Azula, which honestly just makes the half-story moments from earlier all the more baffling.
It's hard to reconcile the two.
Right. If you possess the screenwriting skill to perfectly distill the tragedy of a mother protecting her children, how do you completely miss the profound structural significance of a boy lighting lanterns on a date?
It strongly suggests a fractured, uneven development process. It implies a writer's room where some elements of the original story are treated with deep structural reverence, while other elements are merely skimmed for their aesthetic value without anyone pausing to understand their underlying narrative purpose.
It feels like different people wrote different episodes.
And unfortunately, this unevenness isn't just limited to overarching character arc. It extends to the very structural mechanics of television production.
Right, because even when you manage to fix the character arcs and map out a great season outline, an adaptation can still trip over the basic nuts and bolts of how a story is visually and verbally delivered to the audience. Let's talk about the clunky mechanics of the show.
The nuts and bolts.
Because unfortunately, while the broad plotting improved significantly in Season 2, the actual moment-to-moment script writing did not.
The analysis is unflinching regarding this point. The dialogue remains a significant, persistent stumbling block. It is described as incredibly clunky, with a multitude of poorly constructed lines scattered across the entire
People talking like robots.
Yes. This is, unfortunately, a very common pitfall in modern fantasy and sci-fi adaptation. Because the writers are dealing with complex lore and condensed runtimes, the dialogue often becomes entirely fictional.
Just characters reading Wikipedia pages to each other.
Characters state their feelings and motivations directly to the camera, rather than subtextually revealing them through action and...
It's the classic show-don't-tell problem, but weaponized by a massive budget. And this mechanical failure seems to culminate in how the show handles the political plotting in the Earth Kingdom. Let's look at the character of Long Feng.
Oh, Long Feng. This is a big one.
In the original series, he is the Grand Vizier of Ba Sing Se, the head of the secret police, and he is very obviously an evil, manipulative, ruthless control freak. He's a classic, terrifying villain pulling the strings behind the throne.
Very unambiguous.
The Netflix version attempts to add nuance. They change him to be a softer, slightly more sympathetic figure. He acts as a confidant for Aang, framing himself not as a tyrant, but as just another man burdened by the immense, impossible pressure of power and responsibility.
Conceptually, trying to create a sympathetic mirror for Aang's own anxieties about the burden of power is a solid literary instinct. The problem is not the concept. The problem is the mechanical action.
How so?
The analysis notes that the show fundamentally fails to stick the landing with this new interpretation.
Okay, I'll push back a bit on the concept.
Yeah.
How does softening a villain mechanically ruin the pacing of the story? If he's more nuanced, shouldn't the story be more
Nuance is good, but fiction requires friction. When you soften the primary antagonist of a political thriller arc, you remove the friction. The culminating event of the Ba Sing Se storyline is a massive hostile coup. A coup needs a ruthless tactician behind it to feel insurmountable. If the mastermind orchestrating the takeover is portrayed as sympathetic and merely stressed by responsibility, the dramatic tension
the stakes feel low.
The hostile takeover of the city feels small, feels shallow. It lacks the terrifying weight of a true villain executing a masterstroke, which means the hero's ultimate failure to stop him doesn't hit as hard.
Ah, I see. They changed the setup, but they didn't calculate how that change would destroy the mechanical payoff. And this mechanical failure extends beyond the script and into the visual symbolism of the show.
This was a really fascinating part of the critique.
This is a point I found genuinely fascinating too. Let's talk about the fall of Ba Sing Se. For context, Ba Sing Se is this massive, sprawling city protected by giant, towering, supposedly impenetrable outer wall. At the end of the season, the Fire Nation finally breaches those walls and takes.
It's a huge moment.
In the adaptation, we are verbally told the city has fallen. We see Fire Nation soldiers marching around the interior street, but we never actually see the giant walls physically come down.
This raises an important question about how much of storytelling relies entirely on visual metaphor. In the original series, the literal physical crumbling of those massive stone walls was not just a plot point to explain how the army got inside.
No, it meant so much more.
It was the symbolic fall of it was an evocative, devastating visual representation of the shattering of the Earth Kingdom's isolation, safety, and ignorance. The analysis argues that by removing that specific imagery, the visual beats of the finale simply don't have the psychological impact they require.
Now, when I hear that a massive CGI-heavy event like bringing down giant walls was omitted from a high-budget television show, my mind immediately goes to the realities of physical production.
Following the money.
Right. I wonder if the writers desperately wanted the walls to fall in the script. But the line producers looked at the spreadsheet and said, look, we spent our entire visual effects budget rendering Aang's crystal armor and Azula's blue fire in the catacombs. We literally cannot afford to render a wall collapse.
That happens all the time.
It might not have been a creative choice at all. It might have been a brutal logistical constraint.
That is a highly plausible, even probable scenario in the reality of television production. Money dictates art. However, from the perspective of literary critique and the final product delivered to the audience, the reason almost doesn't matter.
It doesn't fix the show.
Whether it was a profound creative oversight or a strict budgetary mandate, the mechanical result is exactly the same. The audience is deprived of the emotional catharsis that the visual metaphor provided. As the analysis concludes regarding these mechanical and structural issues, we are left seeing half a story, and crucially, it is not being replaced by a better half.
Okay, we've spent a massive amount of time breaking down these incredibly intricate storytelling mechanics. We've talked about character agency, the paradox of fan service, additive destruction, and the importance of visual metaphor.
It's been a deep dive.
It really has. But I think it's crucial to pause and ask, who is actually making these critiques?
Yeah.
Why should we trust their diagnosis of what makes good or bad writing? Because, let's be honest, the internet is flooded with angry fans screaming into webcams about how a show ruined their childhood. Why is this analysis different?
A very necessary distinction. The origin and perspective of a critique profoundly change how we process the information. The YouTube creator we are discussing, Hello Future Me, is not approaching this material simply from the standpoint of nostalgic fandom.
They aren't just a fanboy.
No, they're approaching it as a structural diagnosis by a working professional practitioner of the craft.
Right. This creator is a published author. Their writing has appeared in various traditional publishing space, and they have sold over 100,000 independent books. That is a massive, verifiable accomplishment in the publishing.
It takes real skill to sell that many books.
Furthermore, they work professionally in game writing. They literally construct complex, branching, interactive narratives for a living, and the origin story of their career is fascinating.
Oh, how did they get started?
They got into writing precisely because, as a kid, they loved Avatar so much that they used to forensically study the episode, not just watch them for entertainment, but dissect them to try and figure out the underlying mechanisms of why the emotional beats worked.
That is the fundamental difference between a consumer of art and a practitioner. A consumer knows when a piece of media makes them feel. A practitioner knows how the machinery was assembled to generate that.
They can see the matrix.
Exactly. Over years of doing this kind of intense narrative analysis on discussing world building, fantasy tropes, and sci-fi structures, they eventually codified all of these discussions in 3 independent published books.
What are the books about?
These books are essentially masterclass textbooks on the literary mechanics of story. They cover incredibly complex, nuanced topics: how to handle power escalation in a hard magic system, how to construct psychologically believable redemption arc, how to manage character conflict without making try, and how to write effective subtextual dialogue.
Volume 3 is apparently their personal favorite, by the way, if you're looking to pick one up and study the craft. But seriously, when you realize the depth of this creator's professional expertise, their critique of the Netflix show hit me differently.
It has weight.
When they joke in their video that maybe the Netflix guys should have read these books, it sounds at first like a cheeky, arrogant YouTube comment. But when you unpack it, it actually highlights a massive foundational gap in the modern entertainment.
It perfectly highlights the vast chasm between understanding the lore of a franchise and understanding the narrative architecture of a franchise.
Those are 2 very different things.
The producers and executives at Netflix clearly understand the lore. They have the wikis memorized. They know exactly what the costumes should look like. They know the specific names of the martial arts moves. They know the plot summaries of every single episode.
They have all the trivia facts.
But understanding lore is not the same as understanding how to build a story. Lore is the paint. Architecture is the house. You can have the exact right color paint, but if you don't know how to pour a foundation of character agency, the house will collapse.
If you are the kind of person who loves to learn, the kind of person who listens to deep dives like this one, this is the ultimate exercise in media literacy.
It really is.
Looking at a massive, multi-million-dollar Hollywood production through the eyes of an independent author who literally wrote the textbook on redemption arc. It completely changes how you consume television. It forces a paradigm shift.
It changes your perspective.
It moves you from asking the passive question, did they include my favorite character, to asking the active, critical question, did they preserve my favorite character's autonomy and internal logic?
Which is the question we should all be asking.
And for those of you who want to go even deeper into this specific masterclass, the creator actually produced a massive 2-hour episode-by-episode deep dive available on the streaming platform Nebula. They chart their real-time reactions and structural critiques as they watch this.
A 2-hour breakdown, that's dedication.
It is an incredible, invaluable resource for anyone who loves the mechanics of writing or just wants to be a smarter consumer of media.
It empowers the audience. Media literacy allows you to articulate exactly why a show feels off, moving beyond a vague, frustrating sense of dissatisfaction into concrete, actionable criticism of the form.
Well, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started with a simple 30-second date in a softly lit courtyard, and we ended up dissecting the very soul of how stories are translated across different mediums.
We went everywhere.
We unpacked how omitting a seemingly tiny detail, like a traumatized boy actively choosing to light lanterns with his fire, can systematically unravel a character's internal autonomy.
The butterfly effect of screenwriting.
We explored the paradox of faithfulness, learning why shot-for-shot CGI-heavy remakes of cool fight scenes do not equal emotional depth if the underlying chain of decisions is erased.
The snowball fight in the White Room.
Exactly. But we also celebrated the triumphs of adaptation. We saw how smart, deliberate additive changes, like the chilling lethal evolution of Azula and the heartbreaking grounding simplification of Ursa's trauma, prove that adaptation is not a rigid mathematical science. It is a delicate, highly complex art.
It requires a surgical understanding of material. You must know exactly what to cut, what to fundamentally transform in order to preserve the emotional core of the narrative in a new format.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And remember, if you want to elevate your own understanding of storytelling mechanics, be sure to look up the books in the Nebula video by Hello Future Me. It will completely change how you engage with the media you love.
It's highly recommended.
But before we wrap up today's deep dive, we want to leave you with a final thought. We want to circle back to that uncanny valley feeling we talked about at the very beginning, that nagging sensation of sitting on your couch, watching something that looks photographically perfect but feels entirely hollow.
Consider this as you navigate the endless modern stream of franchise reboots, remakes, and live-action adaptations. If a production meticulously copies the wardrobe, the dialogue, and the specific martial arts moves of a beloved story, but fundamentally alters or removes the character's internal decision-making process.
Are you actually watching an adaptation of the story, or are you just watching an incredibly expensive, highly produced work of cosplay?
That is the question.
Wow. Think about that the next time you hit play on a highly anticipated reboot. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. Keep questioning the stories you watch, keep looking for those active choices, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.